Hello, this is Jelle, growing bonsai, and today we are looking at Japanese maple foliage. This was actually a question on my channel, whether I could look at my garden for some damage on Japanese maples and explain for each different damage type how you can recognize it and maybe how you can avoid it. If you look at the fora, it seems that a lot of people have difficulties understanding why their foliage doesn't look all that great. The foliage looks tattered, and people are often worried, I have a fungal infection, or my roots are rotting, or I have sunburn. Now, how do you recognize the different forms of foliage damage? And maybe that will help you to understand what's happening in your tree and how you can avoid it in the future. I have grouped the damage types in 5 types. First type, something is wrong with the roots. Second type, I've misfertilized. Third type, the sun was too bright. Fourth type, mechanical damage such as wind. Fifth, fungal infection. And to be honest, I wish it was that simple that there's just 5 categories. Each category can have subcategories. So if you look at water, it could be too much, but it could also be too little. And if you look at fertilizer, it could be too much and it could be too little. And these things interact with each other. Just telling you what these look like doesn't work, so I went around in my garden and I looked for a number of trees that have damage on their leaves. I'll explain what I see on the leaves, how I recognize the different types of damage, and how I could try to avoid it next time. So if you take a leaf, and I have a nice leaf here, they are nice and green, but some of these leaves on this Diagnosing maple have brown points. These brown points are not typically a fungal infection. The tips of these leaves, you can see they are brown, and that typically is the result of insufficient water in the leaves. So that means watering too little, right? Maybe, but more likely than not it is over fertilizing. You know what happens if you start fertilizing heavily? Then the concentration of fertilizer in your pot increases. As a result, at a certain point the roots are unable to extract water from the soil with the fertilizer, and instead the water is extracted from the roots. The root tips dry out, and as a result the tips of your leaves, or even the tip of the branch, dries out and becomes black. And the same thing happens if you just don't water enough. Water evaporates, so the concentration in the substrate increases. The roots can't draw up water from the substrate anymore. Root tips might die, and the tips of your leaves might die. So these two can happen simultaneously. If your pot is well watered and you have fertilized, then you might have fertilized too much. If on the other hand you have not fertilized and you don't water a lot, then it could be that. Third option, which makes it really complex, if there's a lot of wind, then it could be that the roots are just not functioning enough. Water is just not coming up, and still the leaf tips dry out. So that's an interaction going on there. And then if we look here at this Nishikigawa Japanese maple, you see that the foliage is actually quite pale. Particularly if you see here these leaves, this paleness typically is the result of under-fertilizing and or too much water. With too little fertilizer, the branches cannot supply the leaves with enough fertilizer. The tree might be growing, but it's holding back. In this case, it might actually be too much nitrogen, too little iron or magnesium. There are plenty of guides that show the leaf pattern, and they will show you which trace elements or nutrients are missing, because it's never all the nutrients that are missing. It's typically just 1 or 2 that are missing, and if you add those, your leaves will get this nice dark green color again. So if you look here now and you see all these patterns on the leaves, you see a dark vein with green, yellowish in between, and even up to the growing tips you have this pattern. That is very clear. You need to fertilize better. It's not a watering issue. This one has actually just been extending so much that just needs more fertilizer. I haven't fertilized for weeks, and it has been nice warm water and it is just exploded. Now if you get yellowing of the leaves that is of a more homogeneous color, then typically you're looking at overwatering. So this mottled pattern that you have in the leaves is a nutrient issue. If it just generally goes yellow and then falls off, then you need to look at your watering schedule, because probably you're overwatering your tree. Now it is quite common for the tips of these leaves to really discolor a little bit over the season. You only need one hot day during which the plant doesn't get enough water. But one of the things that might happen afterwards is that the tips actually continue on browning and yellowing and growing into the leaf. This is a clear fungal effect. This is a fungal infection, and you can actually see it here. It is not just here on the leaf tip, but you see it here everywhere along the leaf. There are yellow patches starting to form. The dried out tips of your leaves form an excellent point of entrance for fungal infections. This is not really serious. It is fall. This leaf would have dropped by itself, so I normally just leave these on. I'm not too concerned. The leaves, however, can go completely crisp. So this leaf is in a more advanced stage of browning, and the moment most of my plants start to look like this, in summer I just defoliate. I take everything off and it will start regrowing new leaves that are much more effective than these. But this is a typical fungal infection after drying out of the leaf tips. In fact, you can see here now that there's little dots on the leaf. These are also little fungal infections on the leaf itself. So yeah, as said, it can really affect a large part of your plant, that a lot of areas get these fungal infections and the leaves start to curl up. It is now end of season, so I'll leave this, but next spring I'll need to make sure that this one isn't left in a wet spot. Like you see here, all these yellow spots. This is typical for a fungal infection. It is randomly distributed. It affects the vein, but also the areas between the veins. This is fungal, and this is not a nutrient-based problem. Now there's one type of foliar damage that most people think they have on the Japanese maple, and normally they don't have it. They mistake a problem with the roots for sunburn. Let's find a tree with sunburn from earlier in the season. This Katsura maple saw some sunburn earlier in the year. You can see here that just part of the leaf is pale and the back side of the leaf is still green. This is logical because part of the leaf is shaded by the leaves above, and therefore only a part of the leaf is burnt. Also, if you look at some other leaves, here's one for instance, you see that the highest part of the leaf is discolored. This is typical for sunburn. If you look at your tree, you see a sheet throughout the tree of discoloration. Here, 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 here. This happened after I cut back a big tree and this got full sun. And you see that afterwards the regrowth, it is normal, it is green. So that's also an indication that this is not something due to nutrients. In fact, you can see these things happen overnight. Something changes in the situation. Say you had a very sunny day and all of a sudden you get all these spots and they have discoloration overnight pretty much. Although it affects the effect of these leaves, it does affect the effectiveness of these leaves, but you can see here it doesn't affect the overall health of the plant all that much. These have just regrown as very nice, healthy Katsura foliage maples. Isn't this why you grow Japanese maples? This nice light colored foliage? If there's a lot of wind in spring, the young maple leaves easily are affected. You see here, this damage is typical for wind when you have young fresh foliage on there. The leaves, they are mal-shaped, they don't grow all that well, but for the rest they're quite happy and healthy, although it needs a little bit of fertilizer. This has grown quite happily throughout the year, so even though this doesn't look pretty, it doesn't have to affect its health. Now these maples are in a spot that stays quite wet, and you can see that straight away here on the leaf. You see these little brown spots on the edge or in the middle of the leaf. That is a clear indication of a fungal infection. The same for curling up leaves over time. Now here if I go down you see it much more clearly. These black spots on the leaves, that's a clear indication of a fungal infection. You avoid these by not having your foliage wet at night and making sure there's lots of wind and sun on the maple leaves. Now, and if you put that all together, for people who don't have a windscreen and don't have a sun reduction and the maples just stand in the open with rain, condensation and sun, this is in fact what the branches can look like at the end of summer if you don't protect them. The tips of the leaves are all frilled up, they start curling up, some of the leaves are missing, part of the leaves are misformed, but this does not really mean the maple is completely unhealthy. The leaves will drop off, it is the end of season after all, and next year they'll start growing again. So I don't worry too much about it. particularly not on those, because these are sacrifice branches. But also down low, the rest of the tree, not too bad at this point in time, but the moment you want to exhibit a tree later in the year, protect from direct wind, a little bit of sun shielding, and making sure the foliage stays dry helps you a lot. If you fertilize, use organic fertilizer rather than salt, mineral-based fertilizer pellets. That will reduce a lot of the effect on the root tips. Also, water consistently, that root ball stays moist at all time, and avoid having the pot in full sun. If you do those things, your leaves should stay a lot nicer at the end of the season as well.